Alrighty, so I have finally finished overhauling my trauma system. Basically, like an idea either stolen from Call of Cthulhu and Warhammer and those types of role playing games where you can like lose your sanity and eventually become insane by experiencing a lot of bad stuff. That's the super simplified version. And I've had this sort of as like a background thought in my system for a while. And I do think it accomplished what I wanted it to do tonally, but up until now, it never really had a place mechanically in the system. Like it didn't serve any greater purpose towards what I was trying to accomplish with the game. So, tonally, I didn't want this system to be one used for happy-go-lucky, fun D&D adventure times where you're running off on your Avengers missions and beating up bad guys and then just coming out of that like nothing ever happened. I wanted to more so get the idea across that like with these real people that are constantly getting dragon breath breathed upon them and they're constantly getting caught on fire and getting shot at by orcs all the time and like killing people every single day of their life, they are going to walk out of that with some kind of problem. These are not going to be healthy, well adjusted individuals that are getting in these situations. They're going to be like very, very problem filled people. Very, very like innerly, like emotionally challenged and all that kind of stuff. So I think tonally that was like covered by the initial version of this. But like mechanically, there was something missing that I have since added, and I'm gonna like go over. But first, I wanted to talk about some of the problems like my first system had, and that like trauma as like a system just kind of had in general. For one, there is the question of player agency. I walked into this campaign and I wanted to be a suave swashbuckler, and now I have like suffered some tragedy, and now I am Cookie Mick wears pants on my head and walks around everywhere I go carrying a garden gnome. And the player might respond by throwing their hands up and saying like, well, that's not the character I wanted to play. Like, now I'm just this other guy that I didn't even want to play. And then that starts going down this hill of like, well, why am I even playing this at all? I'm not even can't even get to be the character that I want to play. Like, what's going on? I guess my first response to that would be like, well, you don't sign up to play the Joe Grimdark system if you don't like accept, if like you signed the contract that stuff like this could happen. When we went over character creation on day one and you saw the trauma as a stat that was going to be tracked, and you saw like a madness in the rule book as we were making your guy. So like you knew that was happening. You don't pout upon playing like Call of Cthulhu and then finding out that you're like when your character goes insane in Call of Cthulhu, you don't like get upset that like that has occurred. So the other thing is that I have introduced some choice to give players a means of like showing how this trauma is being reflected with their character. So there is going to be agency given back to the player when they develop some sort of madness. Now, okay, so madnesses come in 5 different severities. When you gain your first madness, it is going to be minor, going to cause you to have a weak compulsion. It's going to come out very infrequently. So, like when you first go a little bit crazy, it's going to be a very, very minor, small thing that never even really comes up and can be relatively easily ignored. then all the way to the other end of the spectrum where it is such a debilitating like mental state that you are in that you are now incapable of even playing your character. This is effectively like the second way for your character to die is to go so utterly insane that you can't function anymore. And okay, um, yeah, so you have this threshold. It's just equal straight up to your wisdom score. If your wisdom is 10, then once you gain 10 trauma points, you gain one level of a madness. And then each time, your threshold or your score then goes back to 0. If you gain another 10, you go back up to moderate, and you just keep gaining 1 until you reach debilitating point. Like I said, I have previously there weren't really any ways at all to get rid of madness. It was just like a constant thing that was always going to build up and just to eventually like kill you. But now there is actually means of getting rid of madness. So what I had to do now that there's many ways to either like get rid of or deal with madness or to have it not actually like affect your character, I definitely had to up the amount of ways that you can gain trauma just for this to even conceivably be a possibility. Which I will say that, like, as long as if it is something your character is starting to develop and you want to get rid of it, there's very actionable things you can do to do that. And if you, with your character, you want to not care and you think it's fun and cool to become more crazy, then hey, you can just ignore it and just slowly become more and more crazy. So, so something that was maybe a little bit slightly like problematic with how I initially did trauma was that like you would just have bad things happen to you and then you would just kind of sort of become a bad person, which I get is the way sometimes life works, but is absolutely not the way that it always works. There's like plenty of examples and times that people have gone through horrific, awful things and then have come out of it being sympathetic and empathetic and like not only like not a worse person or crazy, but they've actively have become like a good and better person out of the experiences they've been through. So I've sort of stolen a thing from like Darkest Dungeon 2 specifically, I guess. I think there was also a thing in the first one. But basically, when your trauma is filled, when your mental threshold is met, you will have to make a strain check. So if you are like really, really stressed out, you're going to have a really hard time passing this thing. But if you are not particularly stressed out, then you won't have an extraordinarily hard time passing this thing. The other thing that this adds is like the higher and higher level you are, and like the more and more strain you can now put yourself through, like the higher that stat gets, the less and less likely it is you are to respond to like these traumatic experiences by like breaking down and developing this unhealthy coping mechanism, which I do think kind of better reflects that like idea of the higher level characters being better at dealing with this whole situation. Okay, so yeah, you will make a strain check. And if you pass, then your trauma just is reduced to 0. You count as like, you just don't gain a madness instead. And not only that, you prove yourself resolute. If you are at 0, or if you are at well, like if this would occur when you are unconscious, you regain consciousness, and if you would become frightened of a thing, this just you no longer are frightened. You just instantly pass whatever the frightened condition is, and and everyone else witnesses how resolute you are as you are like down to your last like resource, your last like ounce of will to survive, And then when you like stand back up and then just go to show to everyone else like you are still up and ready to fight and willing to continue, it fills everyone with determination, and all the spent resolve points that people have used over the course of this session all entirely get restored. Previously, I didn't really have any way for you to regain your resolve rather than just, okay, well, you just get it back every session. Now there is a very definitive, like, if you have this moment of being resolute, you guys all get your resolve back, which I think fits thematically, and it serves a purpose mechanically, and also something that I wanted to touch on that I thought, um, you know, this would be a good opportunity to do this was like the idea that in D&D, the thing that you really are playing for are the moments. You're not like when you want to talk about your campaign in the future, when people ask about it and when you recall things about it, you're not the interesting thing, the people that care about is not your character, the NPCs, the locations, the plot, literally any of that. All of that stuff just serves to exist to create as like many and as best and as meaningful and awesome just moments, because moments are a direct thing that is a story that you can tell to other people when they ask about and want to talk about D&D. You know, they don't care about the classes and the levels and the races and the items or any of that. You just want to tell them about stories. And I think this trauma system will very much so serve to create like just great and awesome moments, because either you will be the hero and you will be resolute and you will fill all your friends with determination. And another thing I want to say about the test of resolve is so you might find yourself like being at just one hit point, which means it's very likely that you get hit a single time and then you instantly just go back down, which one might think initially like, well, that doesn't sound particularly resolute and feel like it's going to fill everyone with determination. That seems like it's going to be like a kind of a downer and probably bring everyone else to like not feel very good about the situation they are in. And I guess what I would say about that is that this kind of just is like a mechanical, natural way to sort of enforce that sort of like Boromir moment where you just get filled with like a bunch of arrows and you know, people don't exactly know how like both you are going to respond because of your like past behavior and the things you've been through, and then but if you pass this, then you really get that moment to like to you know tell everyone else that like they have to succeed, they have to get the fucking hobbits to safety in Mordor. Like you've got to do that. And like, you know, you might just have this one last moment where you know you are going to die, but you have this one moment where you can really like just prove to everyone else just how like determined they have to be in order to succeed, and they like have to go forward and do everything they need to do. And you know what, they're gonna have a whole bunch of resolve now, so they'll probably be able to get out of this situation if they need to, because they're going to be able to re-roll a whole lot of failures. So I think all that stuff is going to blend together really, really well to make for these epically heroic moments. Even though I think they're going to generally be kind of sparse and scarce, maybe. But I do think that the fact that they're not going to be happening all the time, that's really what makes them moments and meaningful, is that like A lot of things will have had to line up perfectly in order for them to occur. The other thing, I'm going to say you can't spend resolve on a test of resolve because then people are just going to succeed these all the time. So the only thing you can spend on this is your destiny point, which right now, destiny points, people haven't really been spending them, really been using them on things. So I like this will give people like a reason for why they are holding on to their destiny points is because if you get in this situation and you pretty much want to ensure that you can succeed this test of resolve, you can just spend your destiny point on that. And I do think like, well, what better of a thing to spend your point of destiny on this thing that separates you from all the monsters and all the bad guys is that you have this and they don't. Yeah, what better to spend that on than on this epically heroic moment where you prove to everyone else that they need to keep going and keep trying. Um, and on the so a bunch of things I've got that can lead to trauma. So whenever you get knocked out, you're gonna develop some like CTE or something. You can't get hit on the head like 100 times and then just walk out of that totally unscathed. That's going to lead to some problems in the future. Now, whenever you fail a death save, so if you are just like unconscious for a prolonged amount of time, like when a boxer gets knocked out and you just or when you just watch those like fights on the internet and you're like, uh-oh, that guy just got knocked out and he has not been moving for like 30 seconds. That cannot be healthy for his brain. Whenever you become frightened, so when people are casting fear on you and they're projecting images of your dead mother in your mind attacking you or something, like that's gonna mess you up. When one of your fellow PCs dies, you're gonna be tested, and that might shake you quite a bit if this happens like a lot to you and whenever you're present to see that happen. There are features that cost trauma. So specifically, I've got like my equivalent of what is like the warlock class is like when you gain the warlock feature, you can then spend trauma to like cast spells, which you are giving in closer and closer to these demonic and devilish or whatever your attachment, if it's aberration, the great old one or whatever, you're like getting closer and closer to that. And like you're becoming less and less healthy of like of like a healthy mind type of person. um and some attacks might just straight up like deal trauma instead of damage, like an intellect devourer like eating your brain. That's just going to like I think a lot of things that might otherwise deal psychic damage is just going to straight up deal trauma damage. Like it is just attacks that straight up attack your brain itself, to really make them feel different than from the physical damage you receive from getting stabbed. And then this is sort of just the cover all, like whenever bad thing happens, when you get tortured or you witness otherworldly horrors of Cthulhu popping out and you have to question all of reality and whether or not when you see these like masters at work that control all the webs of the universe, and you have these like horrifically existential situations where dread really starts to seep in. You're gonna have to make a check to see whether or not that really gets to you and affects you. Okay, so for the madness, the other thing that can happen if you are not resolute, if you do not prove yourself a great and grand hero and that everyone else should really try and defend themselves, the opposite of that, you suffer a meltdown. You just go through this really awful, horrific thing, and then you develop an extremely unhealthy coping mechanism. Um, so there's this like thing in RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress and these like simulation games where once people experience enough bad things and their like trauma is tested and they like reach their threshold, they they suffer a meltdown. In Dwarf Fortress, they call it like um, a tantrum, and then in like RimWorld, there's like a million things that can happen. You just like start going crazy and like you start just doing bad things. So, for example, we might have like actually, another thing I wanted to touch on first. So, for the threshold, for it being directly tied to your wisdom score, this I think helps to enforce that idea that like the cleric and the monk and these people who use wisdom are very strong of mind and strong of will, and they have a higher tolerance to experiencing these awful things because they have spent so much time meditating and praying and doing this self reflection and introspective stuff that has made them good at dealing with this. Anyway, back to gaining madness, suffering a meltdown. So, for example, you might be the you might be the monk of the Imperial Phoenix Claw, and then you might see like some of your friends die, and this might make you really upset, and you might start to take that Phoenix Claw aspect of your teachings a little too literally, and you might start to have like a little bit of a break where you now think about everything from this new perspective, where you try to come to terms with what you are experiencing, and you sort of change your worldview in order to make what is happening make sense. And you might think to yourself, like, you know what, this whole Phoenix thing is a really cool, good idea. Maybe just like how the Phoenix is birthed from ashes. Well, maybe that is truly symbolic of how the whole world works and the cycle of life and death. And maybe in order to create a good situation that all this stuff can be birthed out of, maybe we just have to reduce it to ash first. And then maybe you might just start setting a whole lot of stuff on fire. Which is just how that other thing, how I think that Grand Boromir hero moment could be a really cool, fun thing, a really cool, great, awesome story to experience and to have. I think that time that the monk went crazy and tried to cleanse the world with fire could also be just as equally fun and entertaining. If honestly, I think that might be an even better story because I think that's a little more unique to that character, and goes to more so reinforce that idea of like, oh, this story existed because this exact character was doing the thing. Um, so yeah, he might just like start like burning stuff down, and then you have that story of how the rest of the party had to deal with this, whether or not they had to like chain him up or whatever they had to do in order to stop that from further becoming a problem. Um, so the meltdown does possibly lead to a bit of that madness spiral where one person goes mad, like a bunch of bad things happen, and then one person goes mad, and then they have like a meltdown, and then they start doing other stuff that makes everyone else really uncomfortable and upset, and then that might also cause them to test their threshold, um, which very well could like cause all of them to just like start going mad and doing crazy things, which on the one hand, I do generally think you want to like not create situations where everything can just spiral into disaster and create a TPK moment. So I do think the ability to have some people end up being resolute when that occurs will give the opportunity to ensure that not everyone goes crazy. I think at least someone will test their past of resolve. If anything, I'm slightly worried that this might even be a little too easy, this test of resolve. And like people, because you definitely don't want to get to the point where people are just gaining trauma so that they can test their resolve and give everyone else their resolve. This very much so should be an actively bad thing. Which, on the other hand, I do think I can do that. I think a lot in the past I've sort of forgot about this. The whole point of like the strain check was that as you get in a situation that's stressful, every time you pass, you lose a strain, and I think I've sort of been forgetting that, which is kind of pretty core to that idea of that like that the stress building up, and like every time there's more and more stressful things happening, it becomes harder and harder to deal with that stress. So this strain check should be pretty tough by the time it actually comes around and you've spent all your stress like these uh, on these death saves and such. So in order to have this trauma system really make sense, I am gonna have to make sure I really remember about strain and it being reduced. Now, okay, so that was the meltdown. As for actually gaining the madness, so something I've kind of thought about and considered is the fact that like it is very much so inside the realm of like possibility that this occurs in the middle of combat. And so that means like a couple of things. On the one hand, um, gaining madness is like a very possibly like character changing thing that is going to occur, like a very disruptive to their personality and by the means in which they like make choices. So that might be the one kind of thing that you really want to like sit down with your player with and figure out exactly what kind of thing they are okay with and what kind of thing they really don't want to have happen to their character. Which on the one hand I get. On the other hand, I do think having this in the middle of combat and leading to a meltdown where it makes itself evident, I think can be kind of like a ripping off the band-aid moment where they don't even get like in those minutes to question it and consider like well, what effect is this going to have on the future of my character and all that. It just like happens and you have to like deal with it, much like I do think I think that is more like accurate to how like episodes kind of occur in people that like have to deal with these kinds of things. Um, so I've decided, but in order to, in the interest of having player agency and not just like entirely taking away control of their character, there will be two options. I've got this madness table that you will roll twice on, and then whichever one you think is either more fitting for your character or whichever one you think is more fitting for the current situation you are actively in, then you will just choose that one. And so like at least you're still getting a choice. You are having some agency in the how this affects the story and your character. um, on the other hand, I'm not giving you an entire list of 20 things and telling you pick one of these because, for one, choice paralysis, especially if this is happening in combat. I don't want this to be a thing where we sit here for the next hour trying to figure it out. It will be a big moment, so I do think there will be at least a few minutes dedicated to it, but it's not just going to be we're not going to spend forever on it. We got to keep the game moving. And the other thing, so you're going to roll and you're going to gain this madness, and then The other thing, if you are a non-human, so humans are just going to get a totally like random thing, any like real sort of thing that is something that could occur to a person that would generally kind of be classified as like a mental illness. Those are all things that are available to you. But if you are a dwarf, elf, halfling, gnome, maybe it wouldn't make as much sense for like a dwarf to just become generally like a I guess pyromania. I think honestly any of these make sense for any of the races, but instead of rolling twice, they just roll once on the table, and then they will have like sort of a default instinctual madness that is directly tied to the race that they chose. Like dwarves, they very much so have this thing that they fall back on of the like dragon sickness. When you are in just a highly stressful environment and you are in there for a long time and you deal with all of these traumatic experiences, you fall back on your primal instincts, which for dwarves is to like hoard gold. And you will become like paranoid that people are trying to steal your gold. And if you've seen The Hobbit, the dragon sickness. And I feel like this will give the racial identity, like it'll give more of the species, more of like a psychology that makes them feel not as human, and that they have like their things that they tend towards. And okay, so the last thing is recovering from madness. So this was a thing I was kind of like, I kept going back and forth because on the one hand, well, if there's a means to just recover from madness, well, then that almost kind of just turns it into a chore where like, okay, you suffered your madness, now time to sit in the like anti-madness office for a month until you're no longer insane, which isn't exactly like realistic. And yeah, I don't like, I wasn't really sure how to deal with this, but I do think like, well, if people don't want to be mad, there needs to be a way for them to deal with it. Um, so one of the things here, just straight up a spell of purifying mind. You can just cast it, and then someone is less crazy. Which again, like on the one hand, I figured like, well, like in a world where people can just straight up cast wishes, why not just let someone cast a anti-madness spell? Like how is a wish any more realistic than you're no longer crazy spell? And but I started to think like, well, what is like most villains and bad guys if they're not just people that have all these narcissisms and psychopathic tendencies and all these like kind of madnesses? Like, does this not mean you could just like purify mind like a villain over and over until they're just a normal, well-adjusted human? And then I just thought about it. I was like, hey, well, you know what? Like, I guess why not? Like, I think that would be a fun moment, a fun story to tell. I think it could be a good one to have that story of the players that just purified mind the guy until he was no longer evil. Which again, now you've got a bunch of other things to deal with of like, well, just because you're ostensibly not crazy anymore doesn't mean that all those things you didn't happen, and that you are at least to some degree responsible for them. Which this that might be getting into a whole philosophical, psychological argument and stuff. And you know what? Fun. That sounds like a good time to discuss that stuff around the table. I think that would make for a good, interesting story that could like leave people with a lasting effect on how they think about things. So you know what? I was actually okay with that by the time I, haven't put that in there. Calm emotions, that's just a spell that exists in D&D. If someone's gonna have a meltdown, I think that would be like the perfect thing that you would use calm emotions on. Is like, hey, just don't have a meltdown instead. I think that is like, that's like a perfect use for that spell. And for the professional treatment, if you just want to hire fantasy McTherapist guy and get over your madness, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a month, a minimum of a month per severity. And, therapy, that ain't cheap. You got to pay a lot of money for that. And I thought it would be fun to make this, instead of like a wisdom save, the wisdom is to test against whether or not it affects you at all. But once it has affected you and you need to talk your way through it, that becomes your ability to like empathize and relate to other people and to be able to like convey your emotions and feelings, which I thought was better reflected with a charisma check, which I think could be fun. So yeah, I do think in general maybe the whole trauma system a little like possibly problematic in the sense of the angle of a real simplification of real things that affect actual people. But on the other hand, like, this is a game. I've got to be able to assign numbers to things so that you can either like deal with them or not have them or whatever. I think that's just the cost of having like mechanics. So yeah, trauma. I think this will be. Is it going to be fun to conceivably reach a point where your character literally gets so depressed that they kill themselves? That might be a little far from that escapist fantasy that people are playing D&D for. But you know what? It's the story I want to tell. So either if you don't like it, find a wizard friend and have him cast Purify Mind on you, something that doesn't exist in real life. Alrighty. Well, that was it. Hopefully it's fun. I'll see you later.